horse bolts through the dark and nearly throws two exhausted men to the ground. A shout cuts through the wind. A body slams into the dust, and no one moves to help. Sand fills the mouth, the lungs, the eyes. The smell of sweat, wet leather, and old blood hangs in the air. Cattle panic in the distance, hooves thundering against dry earth. The night offers no rest, only colder air and heavier silence. Saddles bruise skin. Hunger tightens its grip. Somewhere beyond the firelight, a figure waits, watching for weakness. What kind of life forces a man to wake each morning, unsure if he will still be standing by nightfall? This was the reality of cowboys in the 1880s. Not the polished legend carved into film and song, but the daily machinery of survival in the American West. Vast herds moved across endless plains to feed booming cities and expanding railroads. Money flowed towards investors and rail companies, while the men on horseback absorbed the cost. Cowboys were not wandering heroes chasing sunsets. They were laborers in a harsh system built on speed, risk, and physical endurance. The myth would come later. At the time, it was simply work. It is tempting to imagine the West is already doomed to chaos, a violent wilderness waiting to erupt. But the 1880s were also a period of growth and confidence. The cattle industry expanded rapidly. Railroads connected distant regions. New towns rose from open prairie. Newspapers spoke of opportunity and progress. Ranches multiplied, investors speculated, and the idea of limitless land shaped decisions. For a moment, it felt like prosperity would continue without interruption. That very optimism sharpened the tension beneath it. The higher expectations climbed, the more fragile the foundation became. The world of the cowboy functioned as part of a vast economic network. Cattle drives stretched hundreds of miles toward railheads in Kansas and beyond. Supply stores sold tools, boots, coffee, and ammunition at steep prices. Ranch owners calculated profits from afar. Every animal had value. Every delay meant loss. Cowboys slept outdoors in storms, drove herds through swollen rivers, and stood guard at night against stampedes. They were paid modest wages for exhausting labor. The system rewarded speed and toughness, not comfort. It created prosperity for some and pressure for many. The origins of this tension were distant and quiet. They lay in the grasslands themselves. The Great Plains seemed endless, a sea of grazing land shaped by seasons and fragile balance. For a time, it appeared that the land could absorb anything. Cattle multiplied, open ranges stretched without fences. The belief took hold that nature would always provide enough, but the plains were not infinite. Weather shifted. Drought crept in. Winters grew severe. The very landscape that enabled expansion would test its limits. The point of contact between this raw frontier life and the civilized world stood at the railheads. Towns like Dodge City and Abilene became gateways where cattle turned into currency. Cowboys, after weeks on the trail, poured into streets crowded with saloons, gambling halls, and lawmen. Noise replaced silence. Whiskey replaced dust. The sudden collision between isolation and excess created volatility. Arguments ignited quickly. Pride flared easily. The law struggled to contain men hardened by distance and fatigue. As the cattle industry expanded, conflicts multiplied. Open range gave way to barbed wire. Farmers fenced land once crossed freely by herds. Water sources became contested. Cowboys clashed with settlers. Ranchers fought over grazing rights. Economic downturns deepened resentment. When storms wiped out thousands of cattle in brutal winters, fortunes evaporated overnight. The collapse of herds meant unpaid wages and abandoned camps. Hope and ruin moved together across the plains. Faced with hardship, people searched for explanations. Some blamed rival ranchers. Others blamed government policy. Superstition mixed with rumor. Medical knowledge was limited, and injuries often became fatal. Attempts to enforce order through hired guns or private militias escalated disputes. Violence became a shortcut for negotiation. Each act of retaliation fueled another. The line between protection and aggression blurred quickly. Social bonds weakened under strain. Cowboys drifted from ranch to ranch. Partnerships dissolved when money ran short. Letters home described both adventure and loneliness. In small frontier towns, trust eroded. The myth of the independent rider masked the reality of exhaustion and isolation. Many cowboys were young, far from family, and unsure of their future. Institutions were thin. Stability depended on weather, markets, and men who were often just as uncertain. Desperation hardened identities. Ranchers viewed small farmers as obstacles. Settlers saw cattlemen as intruders. Indigenous communities were pushed further from ancestral lands to make room for grazing. Violence justified itself as progress. Minorities were often blamed for theft, disease, or instability without evidence. In the name of growth, communities fractured. The cost was not only in gunfights, but in displacement and resentment that lingered for generations. Beyond the towns and railheads, the impact spread across the land. Overgrazing weakened soil. Rivers were overused. Wildlife patterns shifted. Severe winters in the mid-1880s killed cattle in staggering numbers, leaving carcasses frozen across the plains. Ranches collapsed under debt. Camps emptied. The silence that followed was heavy. The dream of limitless expansion had collided with natural limits. Eventually, the fever of rapid growth cooled, not because harmony triumphed, but because reality intervened. Investors grew cautious. Open ranges disappeared behind fences. The great cattle drives diminished. Cowboys transitioned into ranch hands or sought work elsewhere. The era of unbounded movement narrowed into managed industry. The legend, however, grew larger. Stories simplified complexity into bravery and spectacle. The world that followed was more regulated, more industrial, and less romantic. Railroads strengthened their grip. Meatpacking centralized profit. Towns stabilized or faded. The cowboy became a symbol of freedom, even as his actual freedom shrank. Beneath the image lived the memory of hardship, conflict, and survival. The West had been shaped not only by courage, but by exhaustion and compromise. Looking back, the myth remains powerful. We see lone riders framed by sunsets and imagine simplicity. But the truth of the 1880s tells a different story. It reveals a labor force navigating economic pressure, environmental limits, and social tension. It shows how quickly expansion can strain human bonds. It reminds us that growth without balance carries consequences. Today, we still celebrate bold expansion and rapid success. We still believe in boundless opportunity. The story of the cowboy, beyond the myth, asks a harder question. How much pressure can individuals bear when systems demand more than they can sustain? At what point does ambition begin to erode the very people it depends on? History does not glow like a painted horizon. It carries weight. When we look beyond the myth of the cowboy in the 1880s, we see men shaped by forces larger than themselves, navigating uncertainty with limited choices. The West was not simply conquered, it was endured. To examine that endurance is to reflect on our own age of expansion and speed. The past does not exist to flatter us, it exists to caution us. Somewhere in the vast plains of memory, the dust still rises behind a rider who was never meant to be a legend, only a worker trying to survive another day.